Subnautica 2 just got delayed because the publisher didn't want to pay the developers $250 million, which is weird. Because usually, if you're about to hand someone $250 million, that means things are going really, really well. Back in July 2025, I stumbled across this Bloomberg headline: Krafton delays Subnautica 2 game ahead of $250 million payout. It absolutely makes no sense, but that's exactly what happened. Look at this timeline. July 2nd, Krafton fires all 3 founders of Unknown Worlds, the people who created Subnautica. July 9th, just 1 week later, they delay the game from 2025 to 2026, conveniently past the bonus deadline. The same week these guys were supposed to get paid, the game suddenly wasn't ready anymore. Now the story is evolving. Every few days there's a new court filing, a leaked document, another accusation. Someone will probably make a completely different video about this in a year when all the facts have come out. But here's what we know right now, and honestly, the timing is so suspicious, it's almost insulting. This isn't just any $250 million. This was part of a deal where Krafton paid $500 million upfront to acquire Unknown Worlds back in 2021. Add that $250 million bonus, and you've got $750 million invested in what started as a small indie studio's underwater survival game. The founders are suing, claiming they were deliberately sabotaged. Krafton says the game wasn't ready and the founders had abandoned their responsibilities. Both stories can't be right, and the timeline? Well, the timeline tells a very different story. My name is MRIXRT, my YouTube channel is really cool, and let's dive into this story. And I mean that literally because we're going deep into some very dark corporate waters. Before we dive into the Krafton Subnautica scandal, you need to know what made the original Subnautica so special. If you've never played it, you might wonder why an underwater game is worth $250 million legal battle. Subnautica stood apart from every other survival game. When it launched in 2018, it did something that seemed impossible. It made players genuinely afraid of water. Charlie Cleveland and his small team at Unknown Worlds built a survival game unlike anything else. Most survival games give you weapons and tell you to fight your way to the top of the food chain. Subnautica gave you a scanner and said, LOL, good luck. You're not the predator in this alien ocean, you're prey, trying to survive in an ecosystem that doesn't care if you live or die. There's no real combat system, no guns, no swords, nothing that lets you easily kill the massive creatures hunting you. Your best options are to hide, run, or scare them off. The story isn't told through cutscenes or exposition dumps. It's uncovered through exploration in fragments of a lost civilization scattered across the ocean floor. And it absolutely terrified people in the best possible way. The game spent 4 years in early access, from 2014 to 2018, with Cleveland's team gradually refining and expanding this underwater world based on community feedback. Streaming culture embraced Subnautica more than almost any other survival game. Viewers loved watching their favorite streamers get absolutely demolished by Reaper Leviathans, those massive serpentine nightmares that would grab your tiny submarine and shake it like a dog toy. The genuine screams of terror became a meme, but also perfect marketing. Viewers would watch these streams and think, I need to experience this for myself. Over 5 million copies sold across platforms, with 96% positive reviews on Steam from over 100,000 players. Those aren't just impressive numbers, they're nearly unheard of for an indie game. In 2021, Unknown Worlds released Subnautica Below Zero, a smaller scale sequel that proved the formula still worked perfectly with the original team intact. New setting, new story, but that same core philosophy of vulnerability and exploration that made the original so compelling. Which makes what happened next all the more tragic, because when something this special becomes this successful, it tends to attract attention, and not always the good kind. But real quick, this message is sponsored by Raycon. In Subnautica, you need to stay aware of your surroundings. That same awareness is exactly what Raycon's essential open earbuds are designed for. They keep your ears open while still delivering crystal clear sound. They sit just outside your ear canal so you can stay tuned in to traffic, co-workers, or whatever's happening around you without losing out on music or podcast quality. And it's Raycon's anniversary, where the essential open earbuds are stealing the spotlight. They're 30% off. I've been testing these out over the past few weeks, and what I appreciate most is how they handle that balance. You get your audio without being completely cut off from the world. Lightweight and all-day comfortable, they never feel bulky, and the secure fit means they stay put, whether you're at the gym, out on a walk, or grinding through your to-do list. Raycon delivers the same premium audio quality as the big brands, but at half the price. Add in over 3 million happy customers and a 30-day happiness guarantee, and there's zero reason to overpay. For anyone looking for open ear earbuds, these are worth checking out. Click the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/MRIXRT open to get 30% off the essential open earbuds. That's buyraycon.com/Moriarty open. In October 2021, Success came knocking on Unknown World's door, and Success, in this case, had a name: Krafton. They're the South Korean gaming giant behind PUBG, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, a game that generated over $17 billion in revenue. When a company worth billions comes to your little indie studio, it's supposed to be the dream. Krafton announced it was acquiring Unknown Worlds for $500 million up front. $500 million for a team that had started with one man working essentially alone in his apartment. By any measure, this was a massive success story. But here's where things get interesting. The deal wasn't just $500 million and done. It also included an additional $250 million bonus, what's called an earn-out agreement. Earn-out agreements are actually pretty common in the gaming industry. The idea is simple. The acquiring company pays a base amount up front, then promises additional money if certain targets are met. Those targets are usually revenue-based, sometimes user metrics, occasionally creative milestones. The goal is to align incentives. The acquired team stays motivated to hit milestones, and the acquiring company gets some assurance that the team won't just coast after catching out. In theory, it's a win-win. For Unknown Worlds, that earnout was $250 million tied to hitting revenue targets by the end of 2025 for Krafton. And here's a critical detail. 90% of that bonus, $225 million, was allocated to the three founders: Charlie Cleveland, Max McGuire, and Ted Gill. The remaining $25 million would be distributed among the rest of the team. When this deal was announced in 2021, that 2025 deadline seemed perfectly reasonable. 4 years to develop Subnautica 2, build on the success of the original, hit the revenue targets, and everyone walks away rich. What could go wrong? Krafton's public statements at the time focused on preserving what made Unknown Worlds special. They promised to support the studio's autonomy and creativity after the acquisition. They pledged resources to the team to fulfill their vision. All the right words that acquiring companies say when reassuring creative teams that nothing will change. But here's what I started to realize as I dug into this story. When you know there's a $250 million on the line, every decision gets filtered through pressure. What might have been a creative choice becomes a financial calculation. What might have been an artistic risk becomes a threat to the biggest payday of your life. And in 2021, with Subnautica's success fresh in everyone's minds, with Krafton's financial support backing the team, and 4 years stretching out ahead of them, that pressure probably felt manageable to the devs. Exciting, even. But as we'll see, that ticking clock would end up changing everything. The transformation didn't happen overnight. First came the expansion. Krafton rapidly grew the Unknown Worlds team from about 15 people to over 60, ostensibly for higher production standards. More developers, more artists, more project managers. On paper, this looked like exactly the kind of support a small indie studio dreams of, an abundance of talent supporting your project. But as Krafton expanded the team, the original Subnautica developers gradually started disappearing. Not fired, at least not initially. Reassigned to other projects, moved to different roles. Some left on their own, sensing the trouble brewing. The new hires Krafton brought in specifically for Subnautica 2 were talented, sure, but they were completely unfamiliar with the original game's philosophy. Think about what this means for a second. Subnautica worked because it was built by people who understood that vulnerability and isolation were core features, not bugs. The original team knew why limiting combat made the game terrifying. They understood the delicate balance between exploration and fear that made the experience so unique. You can't just hand someone a design document and expect them to recreate that kind of intimate creative vision. And as these original devs were swapped out with Krafton's new hires, so did the knowledge of what made Subnautica special. Meanwhile, the corporate machinery Krafton created started taking over the devs' creative process. The collaborative, flexible development style that had worked so well during early access was replaced with Krafton's milestone-driven development. Every creative decision had to be justified through business metrics, and their business metrics harpooned Subnautica's core instantaneously. One of their hired corporate analysts had looked at the data and realized that multiplayer games make more money, so Subnautica 2 needed to be multiplayer. This wasn't a creative choice, it was purely a market research decision. But that fundamentally breaks everything that made Subnautica work. The game was terrifying because you were alone. The isolation was a fundamental mechanic of the game. You had no one to rely on but yourself, no one to share the burden of exploration and discovery. Turn that into a co-op experience, as Krafton wants, and you've just removed the core element that made the original special. Performance reviews were implemented for creative work, treating art like manufacturing. The marketing department gained influence over core gameplay design decisions. Charlie Cleveland, Max McGuire, and Ted Gill, the people who'd created this world, found themselves pushed into defensive positions, forced to justify their own creative vision to committees who'd never made a game in their lives. The development budget increased by 300% under corporate oversight, but that money was going toward corporate structures, review teams that increased milestone review rates from quarterly to monthly, and layers of management whose job was essentially to make sure nothing risky or unexpected happened. In other words, Krafton smothered creativity. And their promises about supporting the studio's autonomy and creativity were revealed by later emerging reports to be exactly what they sounded like: corporate marketing speak. By 2024, you could count the number of original Subnautica developers still working on Subnautica 2 on 0 hands. The entire team making the sequel had never touched the original. They were building a follow-up to a game they didn't understand, guided by metrics instead of vision, answerable to committees instead of players. And still, somehow, everyone involved thought this was all going according to plan. By May 2025, the cracks were showing. An internal milestone review leaked, revealing that Subnautica 2 was nowhere near where it needed to be. The document showed massive content gaps, missing biomes, incomplete creature types, absent narrative systems, and core gameplay features that simply didn't exist yet. According to the review, the game was sitting at about 40% completion when it should have been at 80% for a 2025 launch. But here's what makes this timeline so fascinating. Despite these obvious problems, Charlie Cleveland maintained that the game was ready. Not perfect, not complete, but ready for early access. Then came July 2nd, 2025. Krafton announced a leadership change at Unknown Worlds, effective immediately. Charlie Cleveland, the game director, Max McGuire, the CTO, Ted Gill, the CEO, all three founders, fired in a single corporate press release. Their replacement, Steve Paputzis, a former EA and Visceral Games executive, the kind of corporate veteran who specializes in managing large teams and hitting financial targets. 2 days later, on July 4th, Cleveland published a blog post that was equal parts shock and defiance. He detailed how much of a shock it was to him when he was disallowed from working on a title he had spent 20 years building. But here's the real shocking part, he still wrote that the game is ready for early access. Yet 5 days after that, on July 9th, Krafton officially delayed Subnautica 2 from 2025 to 2026. Let's be clear about what this timeline reveals. They fired the founders, who would receive $225 million if the game launches in 2025. Then they waited a week. Then they delayed the game past the 2025 deadline, making that bonus now impossible to achieve. This is the timeline that convinced the founders they had grounds to sue. Viewers, you can draw your own conclusions, but to the founders, the coordination was so obvious, it's almost insulting. On July 15th, Cleveland, McGuire, and Gill filed a lawsuit against Krafton. The legal complaint alleges deliberate sabotage to avoid the $250 million payout obligations. Their argument is straightforward. They were fired not because of incompetence, but because they were about to become very expensive. Krafton's defense was originally swift and brutal. They accused the founders of abandoning their responsibilities and neglecting game development. Specifically, they claimed Cleveland had prioritized a personal film project over Subnautica 2. They pointed to the leaked milestone review as evidence that the game quality was insufficient, citing those missing biomes, creatures, and narrative elements as proof the founders had failed. Only for Krafton to pull a complete 180 and absolutely backpedal once the lawsuit actually started moving forward. Remember how the official termination notices said that the founders were fired because Subnautica 2 wasn't ready? That was Krafton's entire justification. But the moment the conflict hit the courtroom, Krafton's lawyers suddenly flipped their stance and claimed that wasn't the reason at all. So if the game readiness wasn't the reason, what was? According to Krafton, the founders had abandoned their post and deceived the company. They even tossed in new accusations about the founders taking confidential files after they were fired. Allegations that very conveniently only started after the founders' termination. At this point, Krafton's legal stance began to look like a company scrambling to invent new claims once the old ones started to collapse under the weight of legal scrutiny. The battle lines were drawn and both sides started fighting dirty. Reddit discussions exploded with leaked development documents of uncertain authenticity. Some seemed to support Krafton's claims about missing content. Others suggested the founders were being scapegoated for problems created by the corporate restructuring itself. Krafton did do one thing that seemed designed to calm the waters. They extended a $25 million consolation bonus to the remaining 40 employees, tied to the new 2026 timeline. It was a smart move. Keep the remaining team motivated while isolating the legal fight to just the 3 founders. The fan response was immediate and overwhelmingly one-sided. Fan boycott campaigns launched with hashtags like #StandWithUnknownWorlds. For every comment defending Krafton's decisions, there were 5 or 6 supporting the fired founders. The community that had embraced Subnautica with fiery passion turned that same energy against what they saw as corporate betrayal. Pre-order cancellations started accelerating as fans lost confidence in the sequel's quality, having increased by 400% following the July controversy. The community sentiment towards Subnautica 2 shifted from 90% positive to 25% positive almost overnight. The game faced an impossible task, matching a beloved original without any of the people who created it. The most tragic part, the game might still launch, it might even be technically competent, but it might be a hollow shell wearing the skin of something that was once genuinely meaningful. And that perhaps is the real crime here. The Krafton Subnautica 2 story would be shocking if it were unique, but this exact pattern is played out repeatedly across the gaming industry. EA and BioWare. Anthem's development suffered under corporate pressure as the original talent exodus left the studio's shadow of what created Mass Effect and Dragon Age. Activision and Blizzard, where creative vision was systematically compromised for monetization focus, giving us disasters like Warcraft 3 Reforged and the tone-deaf "Do you guys not have phones?"
We don't have any plans at the moment to do PC. Do you guys not have phones?
Yeah, you guys all have phones, right?
You can play on your tablet too.
Telltale Games collapsed entirely when corporate expansion and pressure destroyed the intimate creative process that had made their narrative adventures so special. Even successful acquisitions like Mojang show the pattern. Minecraft's original vision preserved only because it was already so massive that changing it would be financial suicide. The community response to Krafton's actions demonstrates how player reactions can force corporate strategy changes. Fan boycotts, social media campaigns, pre-order cancellations. When players collectively reject products they see as compromised, it creates real business consequences. Whether Subnautica 2 eventually launches and succeeds or fails, the creative DNA that made the original special has been systematically replaced with Krafton's corporate structures, designed to minimize risk and maximize profit. Even if the game is technically competent, it represents the loss of something that took years to build and was destroyed in a matter of months. Thank you to my patrons for supporting this video, and I'll see you on the next one.